Hey everybody, welcome back. Sorry I went a little long today. Wanted to make sure we covered the material and didn't get behind in class. So this is the fastest, most efficient way to do that. So in class we left off talking about lipids. Lipids can include oils, fats, also can include waxes or compounds not frequently in nutrition. They are grouped into three primary classifications. So we've got our simple lipids, our compounds, and our derived. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about triglycerides and fatty acids in the future, but for now just keep in mind that there are differences. So our saturated fatty acids usually come from animal sources. Beef, pork, chicken, dairy. As we said before, the fewer the legs the better in terms of health quality, but all of these contain saturated fatty acids. Now our plant sources can also be saturated if they come from certain sources. Okay, so coconut and palm oils are some of the more common ones. Also shortening and margarine that we cook with are also considered saturated sources. Unsaturated, on the other hand, there's a carbon in that fatty acid chain and it has a potential for binding sites. Now, a lot of times our unsaturated sources get hydrogenized, they're otherwise processed and altered so that they're saturated. So a monounsaturated has a single double bond, and then polyunsaturated, that should say, has two or more. Oftentimes, if that fatty acid is liquid at room temperature, it tends to be unsaturated, but that's not always the case. So some of our cooking oils are hydrogenated and then they end up being saturated even though naturally occurring they're unsaturated sources. Now trans fats have received a fair amount of attention in the media in the past few years. So you'll see things like, no trans fats included. The nutritional labels may include data on trans fats. What you see there, deep fried, I think that's deep fried bacon. A lot of fried foods contain trans fats, pretty much your fair food. If you've never gone to the South Plains Fair or the Texas State Fair, some of the stuff you'll see there, deep fried butter, deep fried peanut butter cups, deep fried Snickers, all those things. They don't have to be that crazy in order to have trans fats. So trans fats result from partially hydrogenated oils, corn, soybean, and sunflower most commonly. And the risk with them is they significantly increase the risk for coronary artery disease as well as our cholesterol levels. So we'll see this in margarine, a lot of our commercial baked goods, and that is now required to be listed whether or not there are trans fats in a given food item. Now, as far as lipids in the diet, our goal here is to transition kind of from the quote-unquote bad fats to good fats. So we want to we want to transition from saturated and trans fats to those that are unsaturated. So no more than 10% of the daily caloric intake should be in the form of saturated fats. And we think about some of those leaner protein sources. We know that fish oil and fish that has omega-3 in it, those have been proven to lower the cholesterol level and to reduce the risk for cardiovascular disease. Now those compound lipids, you see HDL in green there, that means good. Okay, this is our quote-unquote good cholesterol. So things like peanuts, avocados are in vogue at the moment as a good source of quote-unquote good cholesterol, and then our fish sources. In gray there, maybe even red, LDLs and VLDLs, low-density lipoprotein or very low-density lipoprotein. As we said in class today, these tend to be sticky. They tend to line the lumen of our artery walls and thereby increase blood pressure. We find this in a lot of our meats and our saturated fats. So of our derived lipids, cholesterol is the most widely known. This is essential for cellular maintenance. So 10, 15 years ago when ultra low fat diets were all the rage, some of the concern was that we need some fat just for cellular maintenance. So that's still important. We do know that high cholesterol diets should be avoided because of that risk of heart disease and atherosclerosis. That's never easy for me to say. And we find that in red meats, in the yolk of the egg, and in organ meats. So that's why a lot of people have transitioned away from full egg to egg whites only. Now we said 10% at most should be saturated. So that said, 20 to 35% could be in the form of fat. So that means we should be trying to find unsaturated sources. So we want to mitigate those sources that are saturated in nature and migrate toward those unsaturated or plant sources whenever possible. Almonds are very popular at the moment. Peanuts have also been popular for a while. And that's what you see with nutrition. It's very kind of trendy. People tend to claim something's horrible one day and now all of a sudden it's great. One key is to try to encourage either yourself or your athlete to try to focus on 2 weekly servings of fish because it can improve that lipid profile. So fat is an energy-dense source in the diet, 9 kilocalories per gram, and fat does provide a reserve of energy. So during periods of starvation, the body is kind of in preservation mode, and any nutrient intake tends to be stored as fat. So this is why starvation diets don't work. As we said with carbohydrate, fat also has a protein-sparing effect, so that can be used for structure and for rebuilding. The quote-unquote fat-burning zone, you'll see this sometimes on cardiovascular equipment. It's really kind of a misnomer. It's thought that steady-state exercise can preferentially burn fat. That's not necessarily true. Basically, once we've exhausted our short-term stores of energy, we can go into more longer-term catabolism by burning fat as fuel. But if we're really looking to alter body composition for the long term, it's more related to day-to-day calorie balance than it is exercising in a given quote-unquote fat-burning zone. Fat also serves as a cushion or a protector. It's also a thermal insulator. This is one reason our obese athletes are more at risk for heat-related illness, because it's more difficult for them to disperse body heat. We said that vitamins are fat soluble, so fat is involved in transport of those fat soluble vitamins. And fats also serve an important role in hunger suppression. So that feeling of satiety where we're satisfied following a meal. We know that emulsifying fats is a structural process, not just a chemical process, and that emulsification takes longer time than does carbohydrate. So we tend to have feelings of satisfaction that last longer if we've got a diet that includes some fat. So our omega-3s include EPA and DHA. These are increasingly being investigated for their role in concussion and post-concussion recovery. And there's some evidence to suggest that supplementing with omega-3s could be considered optimal practice, best practice for that post-concussive athlete. We don't have to just do fish oils for this. We can get this through dietary means. Sorry, I'm shifting here. We can get this through dietary means. Anchovies and sardines tend to be higher than krill and also cheaper. So fish oil versus krill oil, there really doesn't appear to be a difference. If there is a difference, then that krill oil is actually a little lower in its concentration, and it tends to be quite a bit more expensive. So we know that proteins are combos of our linked amino acids, and these are critically important for growth, repair, and maintenance. the essential aminos can't be synthesized. We have to eat those. And then our non-essential aminos can be produced in the body. So in terms of supplements, people have used branched chain aminos for a long time. Leucine in particular is a common branched chain amino. And I've seen in the past couple of years some supplement companies kind of moving towards complete proteins as opposed to just simply the branched chain aminos. For our vegetarian or vegan athletes, the fact that vegetable proteins are incomplete means they have to be a little bit more purposeful in their diet to make sure that their sources are complementary so that they are getting everything, whereas our animal sources are complete and we don't have to worry about that added layer of complication. So the biggest problem with protein consumption tends to be that our protein-rich sources also tend to be high in saturated fats, also tend to be higher calorie. So looking for lean protein sources is a frequent challenge. Whey protein is one that's commonly supplemented, but our fish and our lean grilled chicken, lean poultry are some of the better sources, whereas our red meat is still good, but better to probably do that in a little bit more moderation. Okay, so in terms of types of protein restricted diets, vegans consume plant sources and plant-based supplements exclusively, and then a lacto-vegetarian will include some dairy, no meats or eggs, but milk, cheese, yogurt, some dairy products. And then ovo-lacto-vegetarian, commonly they'll say they won't eat anything with a face. Okay, so milk and eggs are okay, but nothing that was a result of having to kill an animal in order to eat it. Okay, so in terms of protein, our key here is emphasize quality and emphasize timing. We have to maintain that consistent feeding interval of protein every few hours. When protein is lacking, it can be quote unquote pulled from the muscle. So our risk here is if we're trying to synthesize lean muscle mass, but we're not consuming quality lean protein consistently over time, we may be kind of undermining our efforts. As we said yesterday, most suggest anywhere from 0.8 to 0.9 of a gram per kilogram of body weight. Infants, growing children, as much as 2 to 4 grams per kilogram, so that's basically a gram per pound or more. And then we can also see similar numbers to that in heavy training athletes. So protein itself makes up as much as 12 to 15% of the body mass in a given individual. Protein is important for activating vitamins to impact metabolic regulation. We don't typically use protein for energy unless we're on highly specific diets or we're malnourished. Atkins and more recently the ketogenic diets are intended to trigger prolonged ketosis. And so we'll talk more about keto later in the semester. As I said in class today, I do my best to maintain open minds about an open mind about particular diets, and I think for some folks there's certainly a place for that. Now, we don't have a protein reserve like we do for fats or carbohydrates. Our muscles basically function in that role. So we may have a positive nitrogen balance in cases of growth and recovery, and we'll see that during times of puberty. We'll also see that in the case of a pregnant athlete, and potentially also an athlete who's recovering from an injury long term. If we've got a negative nitrogen balance, that means protein is being used for energy. So, as I said in class, a lot of debate here about how much protein a training athlete really needs. And so we looked at that 220-pound athlete, that's 100 kilograms. So that's anywhere from 120 to 180 grams. That's actually a little low compared to some other recommendations. So the question always becomes, well, who do you listen to? So McArdle Catch and Catch is the exercise physiology textbook that most of you probably used in undergrad, widely recognized and accepted reference. That resource suggests 1.2 to 1.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. McArdle Catch and Catch would say that anything greater than that 1.8 threshold really doesn't give a benefit, and it may lead to storage of body fat. Whereas bodybuilding suggestions, there's actually a little calculator I've included here. You can plug in your numbers and see that the numbers that it suggests are significantly higher than these guidelines from either the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics or McArdle Catch and Catch. So that leads us to water. Water is the body's most critical nutrient, anywhere from 45 to 75% of the body weight. You can survive 30 days without food, but as little as 4 without water. So we deal with hydration a lot. We see this more than most other healthcare professionals as athletic trainers. So this is kind of old hat for us, but it's worth mentioning some specific conditions or specific considerations for patients who may be particularly at risk. One is our particularly salty sweater. So if you see something like this where either their hat or their pits have this kind of white salty residue, lots of times these individuals are more prone to heat cramps and electrolyte imbalance issues than individuals who don't secrete as much. So for as far as guidelines, almost 3 liters a day for women and almost 4 liters a day per men. For men, required daily. This isn't drank, this is consumed throughout the day. That could include food or other fluid intake. If our loss is greater than our intake, we end up with a net loss. Okay? Lots of times in a really dry environment, like here in Lubbock, if the humidity is relatively low, we're experiencing sweat loss without seeing evidence of that. So we have to take that into consideration. Some sources for fluid and electrolyte, for electrolyte. Bananas, well known as a source of potassium. Lots of times leaving pretzels and even peanuts out kind of in team common areas for snacks is a common practice. Encouraging athletes to add a little extra table salt, provided they don't have hypertension issues. We've seen pickles and pickle brine used over the years. First time I've ever seen it when I came to West Texas, seeing athletes kind of shotgun mustard packets to help prevent cramping, but basically that's just a source of sodium. As far as supplements go, a couple of commonly used ones. One is Phosphorus, which is primarily calcium, and this is going to be a fast-acting supplement. So I'll use this one if I've got an athlete who's starting to stretch out and starting to tighten up. Phosphorus is a quick one to kind of get them under control. And then preventatively, I'll use a slow salt like a heat guard, and this is sodium, chloride, and potassium. So oftentimes we'd use the little ketchup paper cups and put like 1 Phosphorus and 2 heat guard in that cup, and then the athlete takes that preventatively before the activity. If they start to have problems, they might take an additional Phosphorus. Another source is Gatorlytes or an equivalent high electrolyte sports beverage. Gatorlyte is a packet that you rip open, pour it into a Gatorade, shake it up, and now all of a sudden it's got a much higher sodium concentration. There are other electrolyte replacements out there. I'm in no way, shape, or form endorsing any, but I know that some cramp-prone athletes, you have to kind of find what works for them. It's not formulaic. It won't work for everybody. Speaking of sports beverages, carbohydrate concentration is one thing we look at first of all. So 6 to 8% tends to be kind of the threshold. If it's less than 6%, they're really not getting any benefit of additional energy. And really we only need that in activities that are lasting 30 minutes or more. If it's greater than 8%, then your body basically kind of treats it like food. It slows absorption. And so that 6 to 8% window tends to be right where most would shoot for. So a product like Gatorade is kind of right in that window. Some other brands historically have been a little sweeter. It makes them something that athletes are more likely to consume, but it may not necessarily be beneficial for performance. If we're talking short-term exercise bout, there's really no need and no benefit to a sports drink. Gels, the energy gels, those aren't necessarily performance enhancing for those short-term bouts either. The problem with juices is they have a high glycemic effect in many cases, lots of sugar, and kind of empty additional calories. So we want to be careful here. Any sweeteners that have a high glycemic index. So if you look on the label of your sports drink, hopefully you won't see high fructose corn syrup, because that does trigger a steep insulin response. Hopefully they have some other form of sweetener in them. And ideally, cold water is always going to be best. All right, that's it. So we are caught up. I will see you in the other class tomorrow. But until then, Brooks signing off. Later.